Picture a woman sitting alone in her car in a parking lot. She has been there for around 11 minutes. Her phone rests quietly in her hand. A message is open on the screen, and she keeps staring at it. Not because she does not understand what it says. She understands every word clearly. She keeps looking because for the very first time in her adult life, she feels absolutely no urge to answer it. And that feeling scares her deeply. Not because the message is harmful, and not because the person who sent it is dangerous, but because the woman sitting there suddenly realizes something about herself she has never truly faced before. She no longer cares the way she used to, and she does not know who she is without that caring part of herself. If you have ever sat inside that kind of silence, if you have ever felt that strange and heavy stillness where the part of you that always rushes toward other people's pain suddenly becomes quiet, then this message is for you. Because what happens after that moment in the parking lot is not what most people imagine. It is not cruelty. It is not emotional damage. It is not a breakdown. It is one of the most exact and powerful psychological changes a human being can experience. And once you truly understand what it really means, you will never look at it the same way again. The first thing that matters is understanding what an empath truly is underneath the label, because the word is often used in ways that miss the deeper truth behind the behavior. People usually use the word empath to describe someone sensitive, someone emotional, someone who cries easily, or absorbs the mood of every room they walk into. And while those things may be true, they do not fully explain the deeper pattern. An empath does not simply feel more emotions than other people. An empath builds her entire identity around responding to what other people feel. That is the difference that matters most. It is not only sensitivity, it becomes identity. Her worth becomes connected to how useful she is to others. Her sense of belonging becomes tied to how available she stays. And her idea of love slowly becomes mixed with rescuing, comforting, carrying, fixing, and emotionally supporting everyone around her. That is not simply a personality trait. It is a psychological structure built slowly over many years, often beginning during childhood experiences. Many empaths do not even realize where this behavior originally started. They only know that helping people feels natural to them. Paying attention to the needs of others feels automatic. Putting themselves second feels normal without needing to think about it. And for many years, this pattern seems to work. People appreciate her kindness. They feel drawn toward her presence. She becomes the person everyone contacts first, the one who listens carefully, the one who rarely judges anyone, the one who always has time, patience, and emotional support available for everybody else. And for a while that feels like love. It feels like connection and purpose until eventually one day it no longer feels that way. Something inside her begins to change quietly beneath the surface of her everyday life. There is a certain type of exhaustion that does not come from work, stress, or lack of sleep. It is an exhaustion that settles deep inside the chest. It comes from giving every emotional piece of yourself away and then looking around only to realize nobody is there for you. The people who drained your energy are absent. The love you gave so freely did not create the connection you hoped for. Instead, it created dependence. It created expectations. It created a version of you who was never allowed to feel tired, never allowed to need support, and never allowed to ask for anything without first giving far more in return. And somewhere inside that exhaustion, something deeply important begins happening quietly. The empath begins observing everything differently than before, and her awareness starts becoming sharper. She starts paying attention not only to what people say, but to what they repeatedly do. She begins noticing the distance between words and actions. She begins recognizing patterns she once ignored because she was too understanding and too forgiving to admit the truth. She notices the friend who only appears during personal emergencies. She notices the partner who softens just enough to pull her back whenever she tries to leave emotionally. She notices the family member who constantly receives endless patience from her while offering none in return. For the first time, she truly sees these patterns clearly. And that moment of seeing becomes the beginning of everything that follows afterward. It changes the way she understands relationships, emotional responsibility, and even her own role inside the lives of other people around her. This is where the psychology becomes truly interesting, and also where many people misunderstand what is happening. Most assume that when an empath begins pulling away emotionally, it means she is damaged, guarded, emotionally shut down, or disconnected from others. But psychology tells a different story completely. What is actually happening is called a shift in internal locus of control. For most of her life, her emotional direction pointed outward toward everyone else. Other people's emotions controlled her emotional state. Their approval controlled her sense of value. Their needs shaped her schedule, priorities, and decisions. That is what psychologists describe as an external locus of control. And when that pattern continues for too long without balance or mutual care, the nervous system slowly begins correcting itself in a powerful and necessary way. She slowly stops feeling responsible for emotional problems that other people refuse to handle themselves. She stops treating everyone else's chaos as a personal mission she must solve. She begins separating what she can truly influence from what she only imagined she could control for years. And that realization feels painful in the most necessary and healing way possible. Because once you recognize that you have spent huge amounts of emotional energy trying to repair situations that were never truly yours to repair, one question becomes impossible to avoid. What would happen if you kept that energy for yourself instead? That single question begins changing the structure of everything inside her life. It changes how she views relationships, emotional labor, personal boundaries, and even her understanding of love, loyalty, and responsibility toward herself and other people. Now, it is important to speak honestly about the guilt because without understanding this part, nothing else fully makes sense. This emotional shift does not feel like freedom in the beginning. At first, it feels like failure. It feels like something inside you has gone wrong. The inner voice that spent years defining your value through giving, supporting, sacrificing, and emotionally holding everyone together does not disappear quietly. It begins saying things like you are selfish. It says you are abandoning people who need you. It asks who you even are if you are no longer the person who always stays and saves everyone else. And for someone deeply empathic, those thoughts do not feel irrational. They feel morally correct. They feel like undeniable truth inside the mind and heart. Choosing yourself while hearing those thoughts is one of the hardest emotional experiences a person can face. Continuing to protect your own peace while that inner voice insists you are disappointing everyone can feel emotionally unbearable at times. But the guilt itself is usually made from old emotional programming. It comes from a time when paying close attention to other people's emotions was not simply kindness, but survival. It comes from the deeply learned belief that your value depends on what you continuously provide emotionally for others. That love must always be earned through endless emotional effort. That your place in people's lives depends on keeping everyone satisfied and emotionally comfortable around you. Once you begin understanding that truth, the guilt slowly changes from a punishment into useful information about where healing is still needed. The empath who slowly stops caring about everyone equally enters what psychologists sometimes describe as ego reorganization. The old identity begins fading away. The caretaker, the fixer, the endlessly available version of herself slowly starts dissolving. And before the new identity fully develops, there is an uncomfortable space in between where she no longer fully recognizes herself. She may feel emotionally distant from life for a while. She may feel like she is observing herself from far away. She may even experience grief, and that grief is completely real because something important is ending inside her. A version of herself she carried for many years is disappearing. Even though that identity was exhausting and impossible to maintain forever, it was still familiar to her mind and nervous system. The human brain does not automatically separate what is familiar from what is healthy. It simply learns that familiar things feel safer. So releasing even a painful identity can create the same emotional alarm as losing something deeply precious. But what comes after that difficult transition is worth everything it costs emotionally. When the emotional recalibration truly begins, the first noticeable change appears in communication, or more accurately, in what she stops explaining. The empath has often been an overexplainer throughout life, not because she lacked confidence, but because she deeply believed in understanding and emotional connection. She believed that if she explained herself clearly enough, patiently enough, and carefully enough, the other person would finally understand her and finally return the same level of care she always gave them. So she keeps trying repeatedly. She explains her emotions with incredible detail and patience. She offers context, understanding, and compassion even toward the very people she is trying to explain herself to. She bends herself into complicated emotional shapes just to make everything clearer for someone else. She searches for the perfect words, the perfect tone, the perfect explanation that might finally make another person truly see her heart. But over time, she slowly realizes something painful and freeing at the same time. People who genuinely want to understand you usually do not require endless explanations. And people who continuously misunderstand you often are not confused at all. They are simply committed to seeing only the version of you that benefits them most. That realization quietly changes the way she speaks, the way she loves, and the way she protects her energy forever. And then one day, right in the middle of explaining herself, she suddenly realizes something so simple and painful that she almost laughs at it. Some people are never going to truly see her, not because they are unable to, but because they have already decided not to. Truly seeing her would force them to take responsibility for the way they treated someone they fully understood all along. And responsibility is something they are unwilling to carry, so they remain intentionally blind. They misunderstand her on purpose. They avoid the truth with careful precision. They turn her honesty into something to debate instead of something to respect. And every time she kept explaining herself, she unknowingly handed them more ways to dismiss her. So finally she stops explaining completely, and that silence changes everything. The silence that follows is not weakness or passivity. It is one of the strongest and most intentional things she has ever done in her life. For someone whose entire relationship style was built around communication and emotional effort, choosing silence requires enormous self-control. It means trusting her own understanding without needing outside confirmation from anyone else. It means feeling secure in her perception even when another person refuses to agree with it. It means accepting that some relationships were never designed to hold honesty safely, and that fixing those relationships is not her responsibility anymore. The silence also creates something unexpected. It brings clarity about the people around her. Because once she stops over-explaining herself, she quickly discovers who truly cared about understanding her and who was only collecting emotional information they could later use against her when convenient. The people who genuinely value her still try to understand her even without endless explanations. The people who are only pretending to care reveal themselves almost immediately when her emotional effort disappears. That realization can hurt deeply, but it is honest. And at this point in her life, honesty matters more to her than comfort. Now it is important to understand what real detachment actually feels like from the inside, because this is where many people misunderstand things completely. When people hear the word detachment, they imagine a woman who has become emotionally numb, cold, distant, or shut down because life hurt too much. But that is not healthy detachment. That is emotional dissociation, and the two things are completely different. Real detachment, the kind that comes from self-awareness rather than pain, feels very different inside the human mind and heart. True detachment feels like watching a storm safely through a window instead of standing in the center of it while it pulls you apart emotionally. She still notices the storm. She still understands exactly what is happening. She can still feel the energy of it around her, but she is no longer drowning inside it. She is no longer controlled by the wind or overwhelmed by the noise. She remains emotionally aware without becoming emotionally consumed. And that movement from standing inside the storm to observing it from a distance does not weaken her emotional intelligence. In fact, it strengthens it dramatically, because it is impossible to clearly understand something while it is dragging you under emotionally. Distance creates clarity. And for the first time in her life, she finally has enough distance to truly see people and situations for what they actually are without losing herself inside them. This is where her perception becomes incredibly sharp, because she is no longer filtering every experience through the desperate need to make everything okay for everyone else. She is not rushing to solve discomfort before fully understanding it. She is not creating generous explanations for harmful behavior simply to protect others while damaging her own sense of truth. She begins seeing what is really there instead of what she hoped was there. And most of the time, reality is far simpler than she once believed. People consistently show you who they truly are through repeated behavior. The complicated part was never really them. The complicated part was her refusal to fully accept what they had already shown her many times before. Detachment removes that confusion and allows her to finally take people at face value honestly and calmly, without bitterness or emotional denial. If someone repeatedly shows her that they only value her feelings when it benefits them, detachment helps her accept that pattern as information rather than as proof that she somehow failed them. She stops making excuses for repeated behavior. She stops waiting for one rare moment that completely changes the story she has already been shown many times. Instead, she quietly adjusts how much of herself she gives based on what a person consistently demonstrates rather than what she emotionally hopes for. That is not cruelty. That is wisdom. And wisdom often looks cold to people who once benefited from your confusion and endless emotional labor. There is also something important you need to understand about what happens inside other people when the empath finally changes, because this part creates the most confusion and self-doubt for her during the transformation process and emotional shift. When she starts pulling back emotionally, when the explanations become shorter, when her presence becomes less available, and when her emotional energy becomes selective instead of unlimited, the people around her usually do not accept it quietly. They push back strongly, though not always in obvious ways. Sometimes the pressure is subtle. It may appear as guilt hidden inside concern. It may appear as passive comments meant to remind her of who she used to be. Sometimes people suddenly create emotional emergencies right when she begins creating distance for herself. That is not random. It is a predictable pattern called reactive pressure. It happens because her withdrawal threatens the emotional system people had become comfortable relying on. She was a constant resource for them, dependable, patient, forgiving, and endlessly available. And people rarely give up access to a resource without first trying to regain it somehow. So they try different methods. They become softer for a while. They show small signs of change she had always hoped to see. They suddenly appear more thoughtful, more attentive, and more emotionally present than before. And for someone who spent years waiting and hoping for exactly that behavior, those moments can feel like proof that staying was always the right decision. It can make her believe that if she had simply waited longer or loved harder, things would have finally changed permanently. But behavioral psychology shows something very important here. Temporary improvement is not always true transformation. Often it is stabilization behavior, just enough temporary change to restore the old dynamic without truly changing the relationship itself. And now, because she has grown emotionally, she can finally recognize the difference between genuine growth and temporary performance designed to preserve access to her energy. That ability to recognize the difference becomes one of the most valuable emotional skills she will ever develop because it protects her without forcing her to become cynical or emotionally closed off from everyone. She does not need to assume everyone is pretending. She simply learns to keep watching patiently and consistently over time. And when the behavior eventually returns to its old pattern, as stabilization behavior usually does, she notices it calmly. She adjusts accordingly. She no longer creates emotional scenes or demands understanding. She simply updates her understanding of that person internally and changes her behavior based on the reality she has observed. That calm and observation-based adjustment is completely different from the emotional reactions she once lived through. Before, she would have been deeply devastated when the effort disappeared again. She would have blamed herself, tried harder, and given even more emotionally than before. Now, instead of devastation, she feels recognition. Something inside her quietly says, "Yes, this matches everything I already understood." And then she keeps moving forward. The final emotional shift, the one that truly completes the transformation, happens almost entirely in silence. There is no dramatic announcement, no final speech, and no emotional farewell attached to it. She simply stops showing up in the places where showing up slowly required her to disappear emotionally. She stops initiating contact. She stops maintaining relationships through constant effort. She stops carrying the emotional maintenance of connections that were never equally invested in from the beginning. And the absence she creates says more than words ever could. Because when someone has been consistently present for years, their presence becomes part of the invisible structure of another person's life until people stop consciously noticing it altogether. Like gravity or electricity, consistent presence often becomes visible only after it disappears. And when she quietly removes that presence without drama or attention, the people who once took it for granted suddenly experience something they were never prepared for emotionally. They do not simply feel her absence. They suddenly see everything her presence had been doing for them all along. They see the emotional weight she carried that nobody ever acknowledged because she never allowed it to fall visibly. They notice the gaps she quietly filled for years that are now left empty. They notice the patience, grace, and emotional support that are no longer constantly available. That sudden visibility becomes the clearest and most honest message she has ever communicated. It says everything her endless explanations failed to say before. It quietly reveals the truth in a way words never fully managed to accomplish. Without speaking directly, her absence says something powerful. It says, "I was truly here for you, fully and honestly, and you did not notice until I stopped being here." And things cannot continue in the same way anymore. She never needs to speak those exact words aloud because the silence already communicates them perfectly. And underneath everything we have discussed today is one important truth. This transformation is not about becoming less loving. It is about learning how to love with clarity and wisdom instead of endless self-sacrifice. Love that flows everywhere without direction, boundaries, or awareness of whether it is being valued eventually becomes exhausting and self-erasing. In the end, it does not even truly help the people receiving it. The empath who reclaims her energy and develops discernment is not becoming colder. She is becoming emotionally honest for the very first time in her life. The woman who chooses silence instead of endless explanations, who allows herself to step away from places where her presence was never deeply valued, is not less loving than before. She is actually more loving because what she offers now comes from emotional fullness instead of emotional depletion. Her love no longer carries hidden resentment created by constant obligation and exhaustion. It comes with genuine presence instead of emotional performance. In the end, this journey is not about losing compassion or becoming distant from the world. It is about finally understanding the difference between healthy love and endless self-sacrifice. The empath who changes is not turning cold. She is learning to value her own peace, her own energy, and her own emotional truth with the same care she once gave everyone else. She no longer feels responsible for carrying every burden or fixing every situation around her. Instead, she learns to give from a place of balance, honesty, and self-respect. That change may feel uncomfortable at first, but it creates a deeper kind of freedom and clarity that cannot be ignored. The silence she chooses is not weakness. It is wisdom. It is the calm understanding that not every relationship can be saved through effort alone, and not every person is willing to meet love with the same sincerity they receive. By stepping back from unhealthy patterns, she finally creates space for relationships built on mutual care, respect, and consistency. She stops chasing validation and starts trusting her own understanding. And in doing so, she discovers a version of herself that is calmer, stronger, and more emotionally grounded than ever before. The most powerful part of this transformation is that it does not remove her ability to love. It refines it. Her kindness becomes more intentional. Her presence becomes more genuine. Her boundaries become acts of self-respect instead of walls built from fear. She learns that real love does not require losing yourself to prove your value. Real love allows honesty, balance, and peace to exist together. And when she finally reaches that understanding, she no longer fears the quiet moments that once terrified her. She welcomes them because they remind her that she is no longer abandoning herself just to keep everyone else comfortable.